with Henry Kissinger and Winston Ward into a Chinese government car.
Hello, I'm Axel Rothbard, Doc History, and I'm speaking to you from a replica of the Oval Office at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library Museum in Yorba Linda, California. Richard Nixon came from humble beginnings. Born here in Yorba Linda and raised not far away from Whittier, he was quite poor, although as he would later go on to say, he didn't know it. A hard worker, Richard Nixon eventually became a lawyer practicing here in California before becoming elected to represent East Los Angeles in the United States Congress, where he became famous for his prosecution of Alger Hiss in the trial of that famous alleged communist spy. Richard Nixon, known for being rabidly anti-communist, was tapped to be Dwight David Eisenhower's running mate in the presidential election of 1952. During that election, when Richard Nixon was accused of mishandling funds, he made a famous speech called the Checkers speech by later historians, in which he said that the only gift that he had received, the only possible impropriety, was accepting on behalf of his kids a dog named Checkers as a gift.
We did get something, a gift, after the election. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas. Black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it.
The American people fell in love with him, and the Eisenhower-Nixon ticket was elected to the White House. As vice president, Nixon famously engaged in the kitchen debate with Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev, in which Nixon argued on behalf of the capitalist American way of life. Nixon went on to try to run for governor of California in 1962, but he lost. After that, he swore off politics, saying to the press, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore."
You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
But they would, because Nixon was back by 1968, a year in which the United States faced political assassinations of figures such as Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, and riots at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The United States turned to someone who they saw as a steady hand, someone who would fight for American values and represent the silent majority of Americans, Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was elected in 1968, and as president helped put a man on the moon. He worked with China to open up that country to American interests. He worked to limit nuclear arms in its engagement with Russia. Richard Nixon was a tireless defender of American rights and probably would have been a very successful president had he stuck with one term. But in 1972, Richard Nixon decided to run for president again, and it was that year that members of his administration were accused of orchestrating a break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters. Even though Richard Nixon won 49 out of 50 states, the scandal involving the break-in at Watergate continued to escalate. At the same time, the United States faced an energy crisis from oil in the Middle East, and it became clear as members of Nixon's administration started to resign that Nixon himself was going to have to respond to allegations that he was corrupt. He stood before the American people and swore that he was not a crook.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
But it wasn't enough. As more evidence came forward, it was clear that Richard Nixon would have to resign as president of the United States, which he did in August of 1974. A month later, he was pardoned by his vice president, now President Gerald Ford.
Now therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, grant a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
Nixon in many ways remains a complicated president. Raised here from a humble background, he, along with his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, came to be the most powerful man in the world. But it all came crashing down on him because of what was called at one point a third-rate burglary. For Doc History, I'm Axel Rothbart.
How are you? Good. A lot of people are welcome.